It started with a sound that didn't belong. A deep, rolling rumble, growing louder, shaking the quiet calm of the countryside. At first, I thought it was a storm, but there were no clouds, no wind. Then I heard the crunch, the unmistakable sound of corn stalks snapping, breaking under something heavy. I bolted from my porch, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A massive, gleaming white SUV barreling straight through my cornfield, tires chewing through my crops as if they were nothing but grass. The driver didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, just plowed through, leaving a trail of flattened corn in her wake. I stood there, frozen, watching the destruction unfold like a slow-motion disaster. I had spent months tending to that field. Every stalk planted by hand, every row watered, watched over, and cared for. And now, in a matter of seconds, someone was driving through it like it was their personal driveway. My blood boiled. I grabbed my hat, shoved it on my head, and stormed forward. The SUV skidded to a stop near my barn, where a woman stepped out like she had just pulled into a mall parking lot. She stretched, adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses, and pulled her blonde ponytail through the back of her cap as if nothing was wrong. Karen. The name fit her perfectly. She was one of those women who always carried herself like the world was an inconvenience. She lived in one of those over-the-top houses a few miles down, the kind with a circular driveway and a fountain out front, as if she were royalty. She had a history of borrowing from the farm, taking eggs from the roadside stand without paying, walking through my fields like they were part of some outdoor shopping experience. And now she had gone too far. I marched up to her, trying to keep my temper in check. "Mind telling me why you just drove straight through my cornfield?" I asked, my voice tight. She didn't even blink. "Oh, relax. It's just corn. It grows back." I stared at her, waiting for some sign that she was joking. She wasn't. She smiled, completely unbothered, like she had just given me a compliment. "That corn happens to be my livelihood," I snapped. "You destroyed an entire row. That's money out of my pocket. Do you have any idea how much work goes into—" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she interrupted, waving a manicured hand. "I was in a rush, and this is the fastest way to the main road. Your driveway is way over there, and I didn't feel like going all the way around." I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists. "That's because my driveway is for people who are supposed to be here. Not trespassers." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "It's not trespassing. I've been through here before." That was the final straw. I had let her slide too many times, let her get away with too much. But this was different. This wasn't just stealing a few eggs or cutting through my field on foot. She had wrecked my land, disrespected my work. And the worst part? She didn't care. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You ever do this again, Karen, and I promise you, you'll regret it." She laughed. Actually laughed. "What are you gonna do? Put up a little no trespassing sign? Maybe a scarecrow?" I met her gaze, my anger simmering into something colder, sharper. "Oh, don't worry. You'll see." She rolled her eyes, muttered something about uptight farmers, then climbed back into her SUV. The engine roared, and with one last smug smile, she sped off, right back through my field. I stood there, watching as she disappeared over the hill, her tires churning up dirt and stalks like a tornado had just passed through. My jaw tightened. My farmhand, Jake, walked up beside me, shaking his head. "You gonna let her get away with that?" he asked. I exhaled slowly, a plan already forming in my mind. Not a chance. Karen had spent too long walking all over people, acting like rules didn't apply to her. But she was about to learn something important about country folk. We don't take kindly to entitled people destroying what we've worked for. If she wanted to use my land as her personal highway, fine. But the next time she tried it, she wouldn't be leaving so easily. I glanced at the tire tracks embedded deep in my soil, then looked over at the thorn bushes growing along the back fence, thick, strong, covered in razor-sharp spikes. A slow smile spread across my face. Oh, she was in for a surprise. I spent the next few days watching, waiting. Karen was predictable. She had that smug confidence, the kind that made her think she was untouchable, that rules were for other people. She'd be back. I knew it. And when she came, she was going to learn a lesson she'd never forget. I wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide, not when it came to my land, my work, my livelihood. She had driven through my field like it was her personal road, laughing in my face when I told her to stop. That wasn't just disrespect. That was a challenge. Jake was the first to bring up the idea. We were standing by the fence, looking at the deep tire tracks carved through my crops, when he gave me that sideways grin of his, the one that usually meant trouble. "You ever hear about those spike strips cops use?" he asked, kicking at the dirt with his boot. I gave him a look. "You got some lying around?" "Nope. But we got something better." He jerked his chin toward the back fence, where the wild thorn bushes grew thick and tall, their branches woven together in a tangled mess of spikes. "Betcha Karen's fancy tires wouldn't hold up too well against those." It was a simple idea, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Thorn bushes were just part of the landscape out here. Nobody would question them, not even Karen. And they had a special kind of poetic justice. She wanted to act like she could roll through my farm without consequence? Fine. Let her try. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jake and I got to work. We cut down thick branches of thorns, sharp as nails, and laid them out right in the path where she had driven before. But we didn't stop there. We mixed in something extra, old, rusted nails from the barn, hidden among the branches. Just in case. It wasn't enough to ruin her tires. I wanted to make sure she felt it, right down to her wallet. By morning, everything looked just as it always had. The bushes blended in naturally, a little patch of nature reclaiming the land she had so carelessly torn through. There were no signs, no warnings. Just a trap waiting for the right fool to fall into it. I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, right on schedule, the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. I sat on my porch, pretending to read the newspaper, as the familiar white SUV came barreling down the hill. She hadn't even hesitated. She didn't slow down, didn't look around. She just assumed, like always, that she could do whatever she wanted. Then it happened. The first tire went with a loud pop, followed by the second, then the third. A horrible screeching noise filled the air as her SUV jerked sideways, lurching to a stop right in the middle of the mess. Dust and bits of thorn bush flew into the air as the car rocked back and forth. From where I sat, I could see her hands flailing inside the car, hear her muffled screams of frustration. I took my time getting up, strolling toward the wreckage like I had all the time in the world. By the time I reached her, she was already out of the car, standing in the middle of the field with her hands on her hips, red-faced and furious. "You!" she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "What the hell did you do?" I raised an eyebrow, keeping my face neutral. "Do? You sabotaged my car. Look at my tires." She gestured wildly at the shredded rubber, the deep gashes where the thorns and nails had done their work. I leaned in, pretending to examine the damage. "Huh. Looks like you ran over something nasty." I glanced around, playing dumb. "You didn't happen to drive through a patch of thorn bushes, did you?" Her nostrils flared. "You put those there on purpose." I shrugged. "Karen, I've told you before. This is my land. If you drive through it, you take your chances." Her hands clenched into fists. "I'm calling the cops." I nodded, not the least bit concerned. "Go right ahead." She fumbled for her phone, punching in numbers with enough force to nearly break the screen. I just stood there, waiting, enjoying the way her face shifted from rage to frustration to something dangerously close to panic. A few minutes later, a familiar blue pickup truck rolled up the dirt road, dust kicking up behind it. Sheriff Dawson stepped out, adjusting his belt as he took in the scene. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the type who had seen more than his fair share of ridiculous disputes in this town. When he saw me standing there, arms crossed, and Karen pacing next to her wrecked SUV. He sighed. "What is it this time?" he asked, rubbing his forehead like he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Karen stormed up to him. "This man, this criminal, sabotaged my vehicle. He laid out spikes or something. My car is ruined." Dawson looked at me, then at the field, then back at her. "You drove through his land again, didn't you?" Karen faltered for half a second before recovering. "That's not the point. He can't just set traps like this. It's illegal. I'll sue." Dawson scratched his chin, looking about as unimpressed as I felt. "Well, now let's think about this. You've been warned before about trespassing, haven't you?" Her face turned an even deeper shade of red. "That doesn't matter. He can't do this." Dawson took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make her flinch. "Actually, it does matter. And what he did isn't illegal. These here are natural thorns, growing wild. If you drove into them, well, that's on you." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, eyes darting between me and the sheriff. For the first time, she looked uncertain. But my car," Dawson sighed. "I'd say that's gonna be an expensive fix." Karen let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a growl. "I'll take this to court." Dawson didn't even blink. "You go right ahead. But I gotta warn you, our judge? He owns a farm too." For a long moment, Karen just stood there, seething. Then, with an angry huff, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car, kicking the dirt as she went. She yanked open the door, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. The engine revved, but the tires weren't going anywhere. I leaned against the fence, watching as the realization hit her. "Gonna be a long walk to town," I said, just loud enough for her to hear. She screamed in frustration, smacking the steering wheel. Jake walked up beside me, whistling low. "Reckon she learned her lesson?" I smiled, tipping my hat back. "Not a chance. But she sure as hell won't forget it." Karen sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. I could see her chest rising and falling with every furious breath she took. The SUV wasn't moving, not with 4 destroyed tires and bits of thorn bush still tangled in the undercarriage. She punched the dashboard, let out a frustrated scream, then pulled out her phone. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was calling for backup. Probably her husband, or maybe one of her equally entitled friends who would come riding in thinking they could talk their way out of this mess. I wasn't worried. She had already lost. It was just a matter of how long it would take for her to realize it. Jake nudged me with his elbow. "Think she's calling a tow truck?" I chuckled. "If she's got any sense, she is. But knowing Karen, she's probably trying to get someone to come yell at me for ruining her day." Sure enough, she shoved the door open a few minutes later, stepping out like she had just been personally victimized. Her designer sandals crunched against the dirt, her expensive sunglasses perched on top of her head as she marched toward me. "You're going to pay for this," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. "Pay for what, exactly? You drove through my land, hit a natural obstacle, and now your car's stuck. I don't see how that's my problem." Her face twisted in frustration. "You did this on purpose. You set a trap for me." I shrugged. "If I had, you wouldn't have seen it coming." That only made her madder. She threw up her hands, turning in a circle like she was waiting for someone to back her up. But there was no one. Just me, Jake, and the wide-open fields that weren't going to magically fix her problem. Dawson cleared his throat from where he leaned against his truck. "Far as I see it, Karen, you've got 2 options. You call a tow truck and pay to get this mess cleaned up, or you wait here until someone comes along willing to help you out." Karen turned on him. "Aren't you supposed to be on my side? You're the sheriff." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm the sheriff, not your personal assistant." Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She was used to getting her way. Used to people bending over backward to keep her happy. But out here, her money and her attitude didn't mean a thing. She was just another person who had to deal with the consequences of her own actions. I could see it dawning on her, that slow, painful realization that she was truly stuck. She looked back at her SUV, then at me, then at Dawson. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pulling out her phone again. Jake leaned in close. "Think she's calling the tow now?" I smirked. "Either that, or she's looking up how to hitchhike." Karen paced back and forth, muttering under her breath as she waited. Every so often, she'd glare at me, like I was personally responsible for her bad decisions. After what felt like an eternity, a tow truck finally arrived, kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled onto the property. The driver hopped out, took one look at the SUV, and let out a low whistle. "Looks like you had yourself an adventure," he said, tipping his hat. Karen scowled. "Just get it out of here." The driver didn't argue. He got to work, pulling out the chains and hooking them up to her vehicle. The whole time, Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently. When he finished, he walked over to her and handed her a clipboard. "That'll be about $500 for the tow," he said, matter-of-factly. Her face went pale. $500. Yup. And that's just to get it to town. Repairs are another story. Karen looked like she was about to explode. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her wallet, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching her credit card like it was her last lifeline. She shoved it at him, muttering curses under her breath. I watched the entire thing unfold with the kind of satisfaction you only get when justice is served. She had walked onto my land, acted like she owned the place, and now she was paying the price, literally. As the tow truck pulled away, dragging her poor, battered SUV behind it, Karen turned back to me one last time. "You'll regret this," she said through clenched teeth. I smiled. "Doubt it." She stormed off down the dirt road, kicking at rocks as she went. It was a long walk back to town, and I had a feeling she'd be fuming the entire way. Jake let out a low whistle. "That was beautiful." I nodded. "Better than I could have planned." The next few days were quiet, peaceful. Karen didn't come back, at least not right away. But word spread fast in small towns, and it didn't take long before everyone knew what had happened. I heard it at the diner, at the feed store, even at the farmer's market. People laughed, shook their heads, and told me it was about time someone put Karen in her place. Then, about a week later, she showed up again. This time, there was no SUV, no entitled smirk. She pulled up in an old rental car, parked at the edge of my driveway like a normal person, and walked up to my porch. I watched from my chair, sipping my coffee, waiting to see what she'd do. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and spoke. "I might have overreacted." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." She pursed her lips, clearly struggling with whatever words she was trying to force out. "I'm not saying what you did was fair, but I shouldn't have driven through your field." I set my cup down. "And..." Her jaw tightened. "And I won't do it again." I nodded. That's all I needed to hear. She exhaled sharply, like admitting that had physically hurt her. Without another word, she turned, marched back to her car, and drove off. Jake stepped onto the porch, watching her go. "Think she learned her lesson?" I leaned back in my chair, stretching my legs out in front of me. "Probably not. But she knows one thing for sure." Jake smirked. "What's that?" I grinned. "Next time, it won't just be thorns."